This is Dateline News and Conversation. Well, got another very interesting show for you tonight. Uh, he was on the show last week. First time I've met him and hosted him on the show. 91-year-old Jack Gilroy. Tonight, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into this man's remarkable life. The headline started out with he's an ex-con. He's a convicted criminal. He's spent time in federal prisons, probably a few county jails, because he's been arrested a number of times for nonviolent, peaceful acts of resistance against the man. But he's also really, in life, an educator. That's been his mission, to try to educate people, to wake them up to war and so many injustices that have been inflicted on innocent people around the world and in the United States. And we're going to focus tonight on something that I think is an example. It could be a model for others around the country. He's a playwright, and he, with others, have created the Rising Together Theater Company that we're going to talk about. It's an amazing project. So welcome back to the show, Jack.
Thank you, Regis.
You know, you don't look like a criminal to me. I mean, you look like a pretty nice, peaceful guy, like you wouldn't harm a flea. So let's get this out of the way right away, okay?
Sure.
What is it that you did, and what motivated you to get locked up in a federal prison and other, I think, county jails or whatever? So tell me a little bit about that past history, some of the places where you exercised your non-violent acts of civil disobedience. Take it away.
Okay, and I'll preface it with something recently said to me by a judge in Syracuse, New York. In fact, his name was Judge Jokel, and this wasn't that long ago. This was because of my crime of attempting to expose the 174th Attack Wing of the United States Air Force that does extrajudicial killing. But I can go into that later on. But you had me just sort of clarify. It's all about education. It's all about trying to get the information out to the people, because we may say that there are a lot of stupid people out there, but I believe the question is ignorant people. They simply don't know. So the judge said to me, Mr. Gilroy, because I had been already convicted and he was ready to give me a sentence. Mr. Gilroy, he said, your ilk is all in this for just one thing: publicity. And I said, Your Honor, you're exactly right. That is that you have said the exact thing that we are trying to do, to educate people. So should I jump back now then a bit to the earlier days? Uh, well, I don't have the long list of arrests that some people have, including you mentioned Martin Sheen. I don't come up to the Dan Berrigan or the Martin Sheen number, and I've probably been arrested a couple dozen times. But the arrests, I think, date back to action on nuclear energy, and the fact that we had, not too far from the school where I taught, we had the largest storehouse for nuclear weapons in the world, greater than even what the Soviets had at that time in the 1980s, right up until the 1990s. And we tried to expose the fact that they had nuclear weapons there. Each time that we did an action, they would simply make a statement in the media that they neither confirm nor deny the existence of nuclear weapons. And we even talked to people from Texas truck drivers who began to question what they were doing. They were delivering nuclear weapons from Texas all the way up to Seneca, which is above two lovely lakes, Cayuga Lake on one side, Seneca Lake on the other, in an area called Romulus, New York, is where the storehouse was. 14 miles of fence surrounding this particular area. And finally, when the break came, and when we were going to have our peace dividend, that big lie, they stopped storing nuclear weapons there, and they admitted it, yes, that they had them. We actually knew people who had probably died from radiation sickness, young women who worked at the place and very often were turned away from work because radioactivity was so high. They had a radium a counter, a Geiger counter, more or less, on their lapel, and if that turned a particular color, then they were released from work for the day. We know a number of those people, young people, much younger than I, who have died from various forms of cancer. So that was the first actions that I had where I was arrested. But because the federal government did not want this to be blown out of proportion, even local people not too far away from there had no idea what was going on. They refused to bring this to court, and we wanted a court case. We were supposed to. They told us each time that we would go to Rochester for a trial, and it was dropped. It was better that they, see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil, and so that was their way of getting out of it.
Okay, so what what got you locked up in federal prison? And the
Mhm.
second part of that question is, how long were you in federal prison? And my God, what was that like?
Yeah, well, there are people, I want to again say that there are people who served much longer than I did in federal prison. Roy Bourgeois, who I believe you know, was a Catholic priest at that time. He was defrocked years later for defending women and calling for women's ordination. But Roy spent over 4 years in federal prison. I my action was well, a number of times. I was probably arrested 5 or 6 times there uh, at Fort Benning, and on the I believe it was the fourth arrest, I was called to trial, and the what we were arrested for was that uh, Fort Benning was the home of the Latin American soldiers who came to Fort Benning to learn methods of warfare, of torture, of interrogation, and what later the journals that were released from the School of the Americas stated was simply assassination. They called it neutralization, but assassination. So, I just want to let people know that locally in this house that I am online right now, and I don't want to have people speaking while I'm speaking. Uh, but what happened was that in 1995, the United States refusing to admit that this was a training school inside of Fort Benning, the United States decided that they would make a statement saying that they have never had any situation where there were people who were murdered or the individuals were taught to murder. Can I take a minute and ask people out there in the other room to please stop talking? Um, in 1995, the papers were released from Fort Benning stating specifically that training was taking place that would include psychological training, torture, and even murder, assassinations. That was released in Spanish. It hit the New York Times, it hit the Washington Post, and it was revealed then that we were dealing with a very difficult situation with a bloodbath throughout all of Latin America. Word began to come in as to who it was that killed those nuns. Some people may remember there were three sisters and a social worker who were murdered, raped and murdered in El Salvador. And investigations found out that they were raped and murdered by members of La Escuela de Americas, the School of the Americas, that had a special training base at Fort Benning. And so then, following that, you may remember as well in 1987, the murder of 6 Jesuit priests in San Salvador, in the country of El Salvador, and their house worker and her daughter were all assassinated and murdered. And it was revealed again, they wore patches on their arms of the School of the Americas. And it was documented again that it was the School of the Americas. Later on in El Mozote, El Salvador, hundreds of children and their parents were murdered because they were on the wrong side of the capitalist groups who were in control of El Salvador. Those poor people were on the wrong side, and they were slaughtered in this great massacre of El Mozote. The French international members of the United Nations, led by a French team, came in and actually dug up the graves. And some dramatic film was made by the School of the Americas of little children's clothing and the remains of the children murdered by the School of the Americas. So basically, Regis, what we were doing was attempting to get publicity to show the people in the United States that this was a terrible organization, that it must be shut down, and that it could be shut down legislatively by the United States government. So when I was arrested, at the time that I was arrested, where I did go to trial, we had 4 large coffins, were actually cardboard from Sears or wherever, that were painted black. But inside of those so-called coffins were hundreds of thousands of petitions that we had worked very hard to have people sign on to close the School of the Americas. So the arrest that I had, I was in the lead series of coffins. We had 4 coffins. The reason that we were arrested was because of the desire of the School of the Americas and the U.S. government not to release the truth of the School of the Americas. And so that was in the year 2000. And at that time, that's where I actually met Martin Sheen. My wife, Helene, and I were in the kitchen of Roy Bourgeois, who still lives there, by the way, 36, 37 years. Roy has planted himself right next to the Fort Benning, now called Fort Moore, Fort Benning, Georgia, just to expose what was going on inside. So we were there, and in the living room were people like Dan Berrigan, his sister, his brother, I should say, Jerry Berrigan, and several other individual activists. And my wife and I were working the telephone and the fax machine. And Martin Sheen came in, and that was the first time that I met Martin. And he really didn't need an introduction. We knew who he was. And when he learned that my name was Gilroy, he asked me if my father's name was Frank, and I said yes. And right away, he thought that I was Frank Gilroy, the playwright. And Frank Gilroy was my father's name, but he was not a playwright. He was a machinist on the railroad. Frank Gilroy was the writer of the first play that gave Martin Sheen his Broadway opening. The subject was Roses, was the name of the program. And the subject of Roses then led Martin to a whole series of successful ventures on stage and in the movies. But Martin also became a very powerful voice of justice for people, the poor people, suppressed people all over the world. And so to have him there at the time when he was playing the role in the West Wing as the President of the United States was really great, because it turned out it was the largest number, I think, that Roy Bourgeois and others were able to bring to the School of the Americas. Over 20,000 people were lined up in front of Fort Benning, the main gate. And each person, just about each person, had a cross. There were a few Star of Davids among the group as well, but had a cross with the name of a murdered person. And up on the stage, we had a woman from Chicago with an operatic history and voice, and she would sing out the names of the children and of the adults who were born. Angela Ravira, and age 5, or another person age 32 or 80 or whatever, and people would raise their crosses, their little white crosses, and say in Spanish, presente. The spirit is there, the spirit is present of all of these people. It was a very powerful movement. And I when I was carrying that day, carrying the coffin, Martin Sheen was carrying a cross, and Roy Bourgeois next to him, and a crazed individual came out of the crowd and threw blood and human feces on Martin's face. I still have a photograph of that somewhere that I showed the Martin. He had forgotten about it. And I kidded Martin later on that Martin got blood and shit on his face, and I got 6 months in federal prison. But where they sent us was to that very after we were sentenced, was to Columbus, Georgia, for the trial in the same courtroom where Martin Luther King had been tried many years back. And we, in the courtroom, were some people who would later on become very good friends of mine, such as Pat McSweeney, who I never knew, and I didn't. She wrote me when I was in prison, but during the trial, she was impressed with the testimony, and she eventually would become, and many years later, the person who was the benefactor, financial benefactor for our theater company, Rising Together. The theater company. But where did I go? The question you asked, I guess, was what happened? Well, we were supposed to be sent. Those of us were there 26 of us who were convicted, some for only a month or 3 months, and then the rest of us, several of us, for 6 months. And 3 of us refused to pay any fine. So we were immediately after the trial, we were handcuffed and led to the basement of Muskogee County Jail, which we knew that was a pretty bad place, and it was. We were supposed to be sent immediately to a nonviolent camp, but Marshall told us many weeks later that they were going to teach us a lesson, and we wouldn't be doing that again after our experience in Muskogee County Jail. It was a miserable place. It was confined, with no light coming in, except there was a little skylight. You could actually see a bit of the sky, but everything else was darkened. Your food was pushed in through a metal opening in the door, and breakfast was they served breakfast at 4:00, and then lunch at 10:00, and then supper at 4:00. And very few people ate. I know I probably lost 30 pounds there. The bologna was often green. We could hear screams during the night. There was definitely horrible things happening. There were 3 of us, and twice a week they would take us bare naked. You'd have to strip down and walk through the hallway, down through a hallway where there was one light hanging over it, and there was a shower. But next to the shower were bars. We didn't have bars, but there were 2 men inside of this cage, and one was definitely an insane man. He barked like a dog and howled like a wolf, all while we heard him when we were going in, we heard him when we were coming out, and you could hear him sometimes at night. It was a torturous thing. Why they were there, I'm not too sure. But finally, our congressman, Maurice Hinchey of New York State, wonderful guy who worked with us to close the School of the Americas, he was able to get us released after 18 days just for 45 minutes of fresh air. You were supposed to have 1 hour per day of fresh air, but it took us 18 days before we got any fresh air at all. And then I don't want to go on with this too long, but after 37 days, 2:00 in the morning, we were shackled and put on a bus and taken to Atlanta Penitentiary. In Atlanta Penitentiary, we were there for about another 2 weeks, and then 2:00 in the morning, stripped and put in a different uniform, strip inspections all the time, but put on a bus. This was a prison bus where you're shackled, your legs are shackled, your hands are chained, and you travel throughout the countryside of South Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina. We didn't know where we were going, but we eventually ended up in Virginia after staying a couple nights. Petersburg, Virginia. We there, Phil Berrigan had left just 3 days beforehand. Phil Berrigan, Dan Berrigan's brother, of course. Phil spent almost 10 years in prison. He left there, and the inmates told me that I had just missed him 2 or 3 days before. They had transferred him to Lisbon, Ohio, because his wife, Liz McAllister, and his family, his children, they were able to get down to Petersburg prison in Virginia pretty easily from Maryland, and they thought that was too easy, so they sent him out to Ohio. Well, anyway, long stories there about Petersburg prison, and eventually the same thing again, put on prison bus, where every place that you stopped, whether it was a courthouse or a jail or whatever for prisoners to get on and off, we were usually surrounded by cars, sheriff's departments, state troopers with usually shotguns on their hips. In our bus, we had the guy doing shotgun was up behind us in the back with his, and we also had 2 other armed individuals. So we weren't going to go anywhere chained on the bus. So that's about all. I eventually went to a camp up in with no fences, no guards, there are guards, but no armed individuals that we saw. But that was the end of the session, a 6-month session with the history of. I learned a lot from the federal prison camp, including a lot about racism, which I won't go into any of that now, but you could be pretty well assured that, especially in Muscogee County Jail, that a lot of Black people, as well as in St. Petersburg prison. Sorry, I went too long.
I have to apologize, because in the last month, it happened several times during your testimony. I don't know what the end result looks like to those who are viewing it, or what it's going to look like recorded. I'll have to watch that, but I have to apologize for that. There's no doubt in my mind that the unstable internet is not something incidental. It didn't happen to me before the last couple of weeks, but it's been happening with every single interview that I've done. So I, first of all, apologize to you and to our viewers. Now, I want to make a couple of comments. I want to thank you for that testimony about the School of the Americas. Again, it's another educational project. The truth needs to be told. The American people need to know what's being done by their government in their name. And Archbishop Moreno, America, a lot of people know about that. I also want to comment on Father Ray Bourgeois. You mentioned that he was defrocked. Well, I know something about that. But there's a quote from the prophet Ezekiel in the Old Testament. And every Catholic priest you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. The same thing goes for Father John Deere, who was kicked out of the Jesuit order, and also lost his priestly faculties. To this day, they are priests, and they're continuing their priestly ministry. I just wanted to underscore that, because these 2 men and others like the Berrigans literally have been put on a cross. They've been crucified because they were following the command of the peaceful, nonviolent Jesus. They firmly believed in that, as do you, and you have throughout your entire life. So I wanted to get that out of the way. I really appreciate you talking about why you were convicted, why you were protesting, and how miserable life was that you and others like you who have been in prison for these peaceful acts of nonviolent resistance against the man, against the system. Now, Jack, I want to move on because I think the most important thing for me that I've learned about you is that you have considered yourself primarily as an educator. In the show that we did last week, you were talking about as a high school teacher who exposed your students to activism against nuclear. You've continued throughout your entire life to consider yourself an educator. You're an author, you've written novels. But I think the most incredible thing that you've done is as a playwright. We only mentioned this briefly in the first show, but I really want to go into the plays you have written, why you chose to write plays, also the same reason why you chose to write novels. And I believe you said that the American people are not stupid, they're just uneducated. And you believed in using all of the things at your disposal, media, to try to reach people.
Well, it appears the spooks are involved in this transmission, Regis.
There you go, right at a critical moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, right at a critical moment, we get this. And I just have to think that I'm being targeted. Um, I
Oh,
don't
I'm
know
sure
where
you
from
are.
or why,
I'm
but
sure you are. Yeah.
so what I was asking was I wanted you to talk about why did you start writing plays and who were they for? And I don't know whether the audience heard what I said before I all of a sudden disappeared, but you said you believed that the American public were not stupid, that most of them were uneducated, and that you realized you needed to use various media that was at your disposal to try to get to them and to get to different people in the population with things that would attract them and educate them. I want to focus now on your theater company, the Rising Together Theater Company. Tell me about when did you start that? How did you do it? And obviously why? And then we'll have a discussion about um, what the themes are, the content, and who are the characters in these plays?
Okay, well, most of the plays that I've written in recent years do have a talkback segment to them. Even before we started the Arising Together Theater Company, the plays Franz Jägenstätter, Ben Salmon, the play called The Predator, the name of the early killer drones that we had, did engage the public. So yes, it's basically education, hoping that when you get people uh, to be engaged actually in a live theater production, there is just something very powerful about that. And if they do have the opportunity to let other people know afterwards, such as they do in the talkback, this can radiate out to many, many people. And we feel that we've been able to do that going back from those days when, even in high school, when I wrote plays in high school, especially on apartheid, that I told about in the last session that we had with you. I think that this can radiate out to a very large part of the population, with students taking the ideas home and maybe taking the idea for the rest of their lives. But how did I get doing it? I guess it's a sense of justice that almost every play that I've written has to do with injustice. The injustice to Franz Jägenstätter, the Austrian Catholic, the peasant who refused to take an oath to Hitler. That, in fact, was a very important first play because that helped me uh, assist Dr. Erna Putz, who Dr. Erna Putz was the author, or who put together the letters from Franz Jägenstätter and his wife, and eventually wrote a whole book. And she knew that I was working on that play on Franz Jägenstätter, as well as an American playwright out in California who was also beginning to work on Franz Jägenstätter. So I was working with our little play of two very important operations that were going on: what was being written in Austria and what was being written out in California. So my play then, it was very insignificant in those terms, even though it came out long before the wonderful film called A Hidden Life, which is written by Dr. Erna Putz, with it taken over by a woman from California, a writer by the name of Elizabeth Berkley, and then later by Terry Malick, the filmmaker, eventually developed a film that everyone should take a look at on Franz Jägenstätter, which is called A Hidden Life. That's available online. I think you can, something you have to pay to watch. But so that was the first one. And then after that, of course, it was Ben Salmon. And both Franz and Ben were on my mind when I wrote my novel, both novels, the novel about World War II called Absolute Flanagan, and the novel on Vietnam era called A Wisdom Box. Both individuals were very much people of conscience who refused to train to kill. And because that, of course, they were considered to be enemies of the state. So from that, that was all over with by about 2010. And then I wrote the first play on drone warfare. It was right around that time that we're beginning to learn more about the secret extrajudicial killings of the United States government via drones. And we have one just an hour and a half from where I live right now, but most people in my area have no idea that it's an assassination training base, or that they once were very proud of the fact that they were the leading killers in Afghanistan, the 174th Attack Wing at Hancock Air Force Base in Syracuse, New York. Their target back during the long Afghan war was Afghanistan. So we only can guess, how many hits they made there. So that became not only part of my play, The Predator, which was of 4 women were involved in the play. The drone pilot, her daughter, a senator from New York State, based on Senator Gillibrand, and then an activist, which was a combination of Kathy Kelly and Ann Wright and some other women. So it was four women, and that got around to a variety of locations. We did it in Georgetown, we did it in Georgia, we did it a number of times in Georgia, we did it in Wittenberg College in Ohio, Syracuse University, Binghamton, Cornell. So that had a lot of legs, and where that all goes, we never know, right? We don't know how much we affect individuals, but when you do have a play with the talkback, such as we had in all of those, you do know that you're reaching a lot of people firsthand, and it's not something light like perhaps maybe watching a television show or even a movie. Here you are engaged in real discussion, which of course we badly need. So that's basically what happened until I finally met in New York City on the High Line when I was reading a letter written by Martin Sheen. I had asked Martin if he would write a letter to a judge in Alexandria, Virginia, who was about to sentence Daniel Hale. Daniel Hale was on a crew of drone mission and told the truth of what was happening, the killing of civilians. And for that reason, of course, he was an enemy of the state and put on trial. And he was up for something like 10 or 12 years in prison. Martin wrote this wonderful letter to Judge O'Toole, I guess his name was, in Virginia. And whether it had any effect on his decision or not, we don't know. But Daniel Hale did serve around 40 months in prison, somewhat over 3 years. So that was a bit less than what the judge had planned to give to him. There I met Zul Zolkovich, who was a fellow with a long history of film, who knows theater very, very well. And he asked me about the play that I had, The Predator, and I told him that I had rewritten it now as Reap What You Sow. So before long, he is giving some suggestions. He wrote a few lines here and there. And but the bigger thing was that Zul, knowing theater and having tremendous connections in New York City, has become the driving force. I am considered to be chairperson of the group, but there's no doubt about it that Zul is the driving force behind the theater company, which is new, in which every play that we have will deal with justice, and it is Rising Together Theater Company. It's nonprofit. We actually, I suggested that he put his name to the play, Rising Together, or rather, Reap What You Sow hyphen Don't Lose Heart. And that Don't Lose Heart was a suggestion by Zul. And so that is the name of the play. We sold it to our company for $1. There is absolutely no desire for us to make money for ourselves. It's totally volunteer, no profit, money out of our own pocket quite frequently. And so we are dealing now with the next play, which will be an environmental play based now at this present time called Rainforest, based on a 1996 short book on the environment and the destruction of the rainforest. So we're on our way. I have another play called On Thin Ice that possibly in a year or so we might be doing that. We'll discuss more about that, which deals with the shame of living in a culture of the merchants of death, where people know that we are contributing to violence throughout the world, but there's money to be made for it, especially by the billionaires in the arms industry. So that's basically the story behind On Thin Ice. More involved than that, but so we're on our way to a variety of plays in years to come. Hopefully, it'll go far beyond Jack Gilroy and Zul Zolkovich. The other people we have on our board is Nydia Leaf, whose husband was Paul Leaf, a very famous Broadway producer and movie producer. Last of the Mohegans, for example. And the other person is Pat Elder, and Pat is the director of militarypoisons.org. Amazing guy who has visited military bases worldwide and has told the truth of the poisons that they are doing to our culture. And he is also a major part of Abby Martin, the filmmaker's film, the Earth's Greatest Enemy, about the U.S. military and what they are doing to poison the environment. So that's a bit, I think, a quick summary of what I've been at in playwriting and attempting to inform the public.
I appreciate that. We had a few interruptions with this unstable internet, but I want to ask you a couple of more questions about the theater company. But you mentioned Franz Jägenstätter, uh, who was very important to you, and I think you didn't mention it here today, but I think you mentioned that Rob Shetterly from Maine, the USA, has a series of paintings, People Who Tell the Truth. Um, I want to know, did he paint Franz Jägenstätter? But more importantly, I hope that he's discovered you. Was there a painting of you, Jack Gilroy, as a person who tells the truth?
Well, thanks, Regis, and the same for you. You've been telling the truth much longer than I have, and hundreds upon
Oh,
hundreds of
are
videos.
you
But
kidding
yeah,
me?
Franz, of course, he's not an American, so he won't make the cut. But yes, Ben Salmon, he did. Rob Shetterly selected Ben Salmon, and I think and people can go online to learn a bit more about Ben Salmon. In fact, right here I have behind me is a portrait that Rob Shetterly did of Ben Salmon. I think you can see it there. Uh,
You,
that was from a photograph. He had to do the painting from a photograph of when he just got out of prison. He has them. Also, he was a guy who was a laborer, like Franz Jägenstätter. He only had like a 10th grade education, and but both of them were brilliant guys, Franz and Ben. But people who are for the people, not for any institution, including a government.
two things. You didn't answer my question. Did Rob Shetterly paint you as a person who tells the truth?
Well, that would be quite an honor, but I think he probably has a lot more important people on his list. I'm sure he has a very, very long list. But thanks for that, for saying that. I appreciate it.
Now, the second thing is, you said I've been doing this kind of work longer than you. That's crazy. You're 91 years old. You've been doing this. I mean, I think since you were a kid, I think you were born with this gene to resist and to stand up for justice, uh, and opposed to injustices, against war, against nuclear, against environmental destruction of our planet. Uh, I'm just kind of really, compared to you, newly arrival here. Anyway,
You're
uh,
just a kid.
I yeah, we're getting interrupted here too often. I have to ask you a couple of more questions that I think you've just kind of skimmed over, and I don't want people to take certain things for granted. You mentioned after all of the plays, you have talk back sessions. Now, as a filmmaker, uh, and with my three major films, uh, they were obviously not in favor of the United States government and were just totally ignored by the industry. So, what I had to do was travel the country several times, uh, showing the film to peace groups, Quakers, church groups, uh, anybody who would host me for a screening that was always free and open to the public. I always believe, as you do, that you cannot charge admission for an educational mission and project. But what I discovered were there was more that happened in what I called the question and answer session, which you're referring to as talkback. Let's talk a little bit now about what happens with some major films that are really important that get shown in a theater, but when it's over, everybody walks out and goes home. In the talkback sessions, tell me what actually happens, because I know it's exactly the same thing that I experienced in my question and answer sessions with thousands of people around the country.
Well, for example, in this play that we have working it now, Reap What You Sow, Don't Lose Heart, the mother is a drone pilot and the daughter is a senior at Fordham University. And obviously they have a lot in common. The young woman was, as she referred to herself, pretty much as a military brat, was brought up on a whole series of what her mother called patriotic duty and duty to her country, etc. And the daughter begins to look beyond that, especially with some courses in peace studies. So when you have talkback, the dialogue that had occurred during the play, and there are also monologues of the mother and the daughter, and what they have to say remains in the minds of the individuals in the audience, and just getting questions and comments is not difficult. Our facilitators, and we've had several facilitators, usually have a pretty easy time of getting people to make comments because you have the whole question of patriotism. And what is it about loyalty to a country when you kill people, in this particular case, not knowing anything really seriously about them except being told that they're terrorists, and not being able to have any control over them other than saying no, where most military people will not. They will say yes. They've been taught from the very first time they enter the military to march left and right and left and right. You follow orders. You do what you're told. And so in this play, the concept of morality comes up, and the concept also of moral injury. And we know about moral injury, and people will bring up questions about the huge suicide rate among the U.S. military. And more people have died from suicide after serving than have died in military ventures in the last 60, 70 years. So that comes up, and in the question, these questions then are brought by people on both the right and the left and the center, and we really are anxious or eager to get our play into MAGA country, to get our play into the red states, where people will be hearing some of these comments and ideas, maybe for the first time, or at least have other people in the audience who will give an opposition view. And that has worked. It has worked even in New York City, where we did the play at an experimental theater called the La Mama Experimental Teacher Theater. We did have people who brought up the usual World War II. You know, World War II had to be just. And the question of just war is very big because the mother was a Jesuit university graduate in our play, Reap What You Sow. And the daughter is going to a Jesuit university, Fordham University. The mother went to Santa Clara in California. And the mother is a widow because her husband, Sean Golden, was a Marine who was killed in Fallujah, was killed in Iraq, and is considered to be pretty much of a hero in the minds of the mother. But the daughter, who of course loved her father, she was only a little girl when he died. She is just struggling with this idea as she learns about the immorality of the Iraq War, the horror of the Iraq War, the horror of all the wars that the American system is able to push on the public. So talk back is good in that sense. That at least people leave the theater maybe asking themselves a bit more about what they had thought as being correct, maybe feeling that they have somehow had somewhat of a conversion to one idea or the other. But at least it's better than just simply leaving a theater and not being able to comment.
I appreciate that, Jack. What you've been able to do is extremely important. Is getting people to watch something which is so impressionable. It's not like reading. It's much different than reading a book or even watching an interview like this, talking about something, but actually watching something live, like what you're doing, or a movie, which is very engaging and providing information that people have not been familiar with before. Uh, it's absolutely fantastic, Jack, and I take my hat off to you for that. I got another very important question before we finish. You're talking about your theater company. Who the heck? I mean, who's in the company? You're a nonprofit. Uh, from what you're saying, you don't have professional actors. Do you have a permanent group uh, that is part of your theater company,
Well, yeah,
who's in these plays? How do you pull this off?
yeah. Well, I think in New York City, you'd have to ask Zul Zokowitz, because Zul does much of the work in New York City. I'm 3.5 hours away from the city, so we have our team in upstate New York does dramatized readings. Although the actors pretty much know the lines by now, they've done so many dramatized readings. But Zul has props. He has been able to come up with a set where it's a real show in our greater metro New York area. You're talking about a place where there are multi millions of people, whereas we have a relatively small population in the valley that I live in. So we search out the Syracuse and other cities nearby to take our play. But in New York City, Zool has a team, and they are professional. There are the woman who plays the mother in the role has actually played on Broadway. The daughter has plays the role as the daughter, has been in multiple shows. They are not, full time actors. They both the one woman is a professor at a university, and the other gal, I'm not sure exactly what she does, but she can't make a living off the money that we pay them because it's a small sum. They have to really like what they're doing. And they love their roles. They love the play, and they love the roles. So it's comfortable in the sense that we need only two actors, but we do need a facilitator. And so we have been able to find some excellent facilitators for the talkback, college professors, and David Swanson, who I think you know is the director of World Beyond War. David did one just a month or so ago down at the Catholic Worker, where we've had several shows at the Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker in downtown New York. We've had students on one occasion at Manhattan University do the talk back, and that's a good idea if you can get college students who are able to handle that with other younger people. And so we have two, in a sense, we have two teams. We have that really professional show team with props and in theater settings. And then we have our team that does dramatic readings, but they're so good. Our two women, they are really professional. Both of the people that we have up here, both Lisa, for example, Lisa Dutcher is a person who has been in theater for probably 30, 40 years and a real pro. And so she is able to be a key person. We have a woman who was formerly an actor in New York City by the name of Narani O'Shaughnessy. And Narani worked in theater for probably 25, 30 years in New York City. She now lives up here nearby. And our gift is that she has come on as the director and as the facilitator. And you do need directing. I've seen Narani in rehearsals, stopping and suggesting and asking and getting people to really feel about their role and why they are saying it in the tone that they're saying it, why the inflection, why the pause. All of that eventually becomes part of the play, and you need that kind of direction. So we now have a situation where we have a tape of the play. That, of course, is not like a live presentation, but we know that the question that we're dealing with is so vital, so important, and that is the justice question. not just war, but this whole concept of patriotism and the concept of moral injury that is really harming so many of our young men and women in the military. So these issues now are going to be available for high school students and college students. And who is going to introduce this as a good thing? It's going to be Martin Sheen. We have Martin Sheen now, who gives this wonderful introduction as to why this play is worth listening to in a high school social studies class or university class that could be history, theology, sociology, philosophy, or whatever. It brings up vital human questions that must be considered and must be answered. So we believe that once we get this out by this fall to high schools and to universities and colleges, that high schools will need only 2 sessions to do it. One session for the play, and the other session would be the talk back. And universities with 90-minute class sessions can do the whole thing in one play, and hopefully even days after still be talking about issues of peace and justice, just war, moral injury, patriotism, the heart of the play. So we're looking forward to that.
Absolutely brilliant. I'm blown away. You don't seem to have any quit left in you. You're talking about future plays, future plans. I love it. Now, a colleague of yours, Bob Greaves, sent me the recording of this play, and because this is live and I don't know how to interject things like that into a show, I think what I have to do is get back into my editing program, take clips of what we're doing, and then take some of that audio and play it, and then use some of the pictures that are on your website to try to help people better understand what we're talking about tonight. So I'm going to be working on that on my own. I'll keep you posted how that goes. I want to finish on this note. Um, obviously, I have a special interest in Father Ray Bourgeois uh,
Roy,
in the
yeah, Roy,
in the pardon me.
Roy Bourgeois, Roy.
Roy, yeah, Roy, not Ray. Roy, uh, Father John Deere, the Berrigans, uh, and a very important movement, Pax Christi. Uh, I was involved with Pax Christi up in the state of Maine. In fact, they helped sponsor one of my films, uh, The Peace of Christ. And I think for me, having been a professional in the Catholic Church, highly educated in Rome, uh, the message of the peace of Christ has been lost. And way too much dogma, way too much theology. And the basic message is love one another, follow a nonviolent way of life. And the other movement that I have also been familiar with, especially in New York City, the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker House in New York City. Um, you've mentioned both of those movements, and I want you to finish by telling me how you've been inspired by both of these movements and people like Roy Bourgeois, the Berrigans, and Father John Deere.
Sure, sure. Well, I really first heard about Pax Christi from my mentor, who I've mentioned once before, Richard McSorley. Richard McSorley was a Jesuit at the University of Scranton, and he really helped change me. I had the epiphany that I talked about, meeting the first Russian soldiers and being in Vienna when it was part of under the control of the French, the British, the Americans, and the Russians. But when I got to the University of Scranton and met Richard McSorley, he had already pretty much committed himself to be very critical of the just war theory. And when he jumped into leadership roles in Pax Christi, I think it was important for me to try to just follow up on what he believed was essential that you just pretty much explained, and that is the nonviolent teachings of Christ, the basic idea of love your neighbor, not kill your neighbor. So Pax Christi has been very important for me. It was an organization that actually started by a Frenchman and a German following World War II, saying, isn't this absurd? We're Christians and we're killing each other. And so it has now it worked I think it works very basically on Rerum Novarum, the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, who's established pretty much what we today call Catholic social teaching. And the very first principle of Catholic social teaching is the dignity of every human being. And that is something that unfortunately we don't hear. It may come from popes, but and a few bishops, but overall, they're all part of the military system and have been for almost 1,700 years since the time of Constantine. So it's a struggle trying to get that across to people who have been indoctrinated by their priests, by their bishops. And maybe we've had some great popes like John the 23rd, who I have right up here with JFK. Nikita Khrushchev should be in that, by the way. Nikita was a peacemaker at that time as well. This was this was painted back in 1963 after the assassination of JFK. John the 23rd died, remember, in June of 1963. So I think that and Nikita was around for a few years later, but he was so important, and that's typical of omitting the Russians, right? We need that painting now with Nikita in there, and maybe somebody could do that. But Richard McSorley went on to advise John F. K. and Robert Kennedy because he went to Georgetown, became friendly with the people, with the Kennedy family. And actually, he was the one that was selected to be with little John and Caroline after JFK was assassinated. I think that I think that Richard McSorley had a lot of influence on the speech that was made on June 10th, 1963 at American University in Washington, D.C., when John Kennedy called for total disarmament. He became a major enemy by saying that of the merchants of death. He became a person who was not to live. And I think that that influence of Pax Christi was very much in mind. When I think of Pax Christi, I think of Richard McSorley and all the good that he did over his years.
Jack, we've run out of time. We're going to do it again real soon because there's so many more things I want to talk to you about and to explore your incredible life and the things that you're working on. And so I'm happy to be able to promote it in a very little way, as much as I can. Thanks so much for coming back again. We'll look forward to seeing you again real soon.
Thanks, Regis. Appreciate it.